Across the long history of science fiction cinema, there exists a subtle thread, a pattern so faint that most viewers never notice it. But once you see it, it becomes impossible to ignore. Scattered throughout decades of Hollywood productions are a handful of films that introduce technologies so unusually detailed, so strangely plausible, and so meticulously presented that they felt less like inventions of creative minds and more like reflections of something hidden. These concepts surfaced once and then vanished without explanation. Not reframed, not reconsidered, simply erased. Each of these films showcased ideas that seemed too technically informed for their time machines built with unsettling accuracy systems, described with near-textbook precision, and theories articulated long before the public ever encountered them in declassified documents or academic papers. Yet, rather than becoming staples of the genre, these ideas disappeared as though swept aside by an invisible hand. Filmmakers who once spoke proudly about their research abruptly avoided discussing sources. Designers who drafted complex schematics slipped quietly out of the industry. Studios never attempted sequels, spin-offs, or reinterpretations of these technologies. And for viewers who revisited these films years later, there was always that same lingering question. How did a simple sci-fi story come so close to something real? Only with time and the slow unsealing of old classified research did the puzzle become more intriguing. When fragments of forgotten programs, abandoned prototypes, and speculative defense experiments came to light, certain parallels to these films were impossible to ignore. Tonight, we're diving into that forgotten corridor, into a file labeled Erased Technology. Inside are 15 films that introduced advanced concepts Hollywood never touched again. Whether they veered too close to sensitive research or merely stumbled into uncomfortable territory, these movies left behind traces of ideas that feel more like suppressed knowledge than fiction. Welcome to a vault of lost mechanisms, vanished blueprints, and cinematic theories that slipped through the cracks. 1. Paycheck 2003. While marketed as a high-energy thriller, Paycheck centered on a device disturbingly grounded in scientific theory, a probabilistic future visualization machine that computes forthcoming events not through magic or time travel, but by predicting them with unparalleled mathematical precision. The system compiles every measurable variable, physical, environmental, behavioral, and processes them through advanced algorithms to generate a fully rendered vision of what is statistically inevitable. The language used in the film, temporal probability convergence vector chain scenario. Modeling quantum-informed forecasting aligns so closely with classified predictive analysis methodologies that experts have repeatedly pointed out the film's unusual accuracy. Years after its release, intelligence agencies publicly acknowledged large-scale predictive modeling systems whose design eerily resembled the film's fictional mechanism. And then the idea disappeared from Hollywood. Future-looking narratives shifted back toward mystical premonitions or lightly sketched supercomputers. The grounded, physics-driven approach to forecasting the future portrayed so meticulously in Paycheck was never revisited. Adding to the intrigue, individuals rumored to have advised on the script's technical elements were not credited in the final cut, and early drafts containing deeper algorithmic explanations vanished during revision. In retrospect, the film's predictive device looks less like a flight of fancy and more like a cinematic echo of systems already being conceptualized in classified research. Was Paycheck an imaginative leap or a polished dramatization of technology the public was never intended to fully understand? 2. AI Artificial Intelligence. 2001. AI delivered a vision of synthetic life unlike anything Hollywood has shown before or since. Machine intelligence fused with organic-inspired structures, suggesting a future where artificial beings are grown rather than built. The film's mecha characters aren't mechanical replicas. They exhibit cognitive development patterns tied to quasi-biological frameworks, implying a hybrid origin that blends living and engineered components. The script references concepts like bioadaptive cognition systems, organiform data lattices, and evolving neurosynthetic matrices, terms strikingly close to restricted scientific research into biological computation from the late 1990s. These experimental ideas, once sealed within specialized circles, explored whether computational processes could be embedded into artificial cellular structures. Curiously, Hollywood never touched this idea again. Subsequent android depictions returned to traditional circuitry or humanoid robotics, avoiding the unsettling implication that machines might possess a biology-like substrate. Even discussions within the film's special features sidestepped the underlying scientific concepts, framing them instead as purely imaginative. Accounts from crew members hint at deeper influences. Some effects artists mentioned referencing unpublished scientific notes from researchers studying protein-based computational models. Notes that never appeared in official production materials and were later removed from supplemental content. When redacted documents regarding living synthetic organisms surfaced years later, AI suddenly appeared less like whimsical speculation and more like an unusually accurate depiction of a field still kept quiet. Was the film a rare window into emerging hybrid intelligence research, or a vision the industry collectively avoided for reasons never publicly explained? 3. The 13th Floor, 1999. Overshadowed by the cultural wave that followed The Matrix, The 13th Floor remains one of Hollywood's most precise and quietly unsettling depictions of stacked simulation realities. Multiple digital worlds, arranged in nested layers, each complete with its own physics history, and autonomous inhabitants unaware of the artificial levels above them. Instead of treating simulation as spectacle, the film frames it as a detailed computational structure. Its terminology is what makes it stand out. Concepts like recursive system architecture, tiered consciousness domains, and localized perceptual engines mirror academic simulation theory jargon that had not yet reached mainstream science. When technical theorists began publishing papers years later, some were startled to find ideas resembling what the film had depicted. Afterward, however, Hollywood moved sharply away from the subject. Films exploring digital reality retreated into single-layer environments or symbolic VR experiences. The idea of a deeply constructed multi-level simulation portrayed with this kind of technical nuance was quietly abandoned. The production history only deepens the enigma. Crew members hinted that earlier drafts contained much more explicit explanations of how the simulation's layers communicated. An advisor who consulted on computational models never reappeared in public interviews. It's as if the deeper framing of the film's concept was intentionally toned down. Years later, when discussions about our universe potentially being a simulation resurfaced, many noted how the film had articulated these ideas years before they entered serious discourse. Was The 13th Floor simply ahead of cultural readiness? Or did it echo structural theories that certain groups preferred not to see dramatized? 4. Sphere, 1998. While marketed as a psychological thriller, Sphere revolves around a technological concept that Hollywood has never repeated with similar scientific framing: a quantum-responsive artifact capable of manifesting human thought into physical form. Instead of depicting psychic abilities or supernatural influence, the film frames the phenomenon as an interaction between the human mind and an advanced physics-driven system. The vocabulary is surprisingly technical. Terms like quantum feedback, amplification, neural event translation, and stabilized thought state projection mirror speculative papers that circulated in niche research groups during the late 80s and 90s, papers proposing that neural activity could potentially influence quantum fluctuations under the right conditions. None of that research was mainstream, yet Sphere treated it as if it were established theory. Afterward, Hollywood avoided this idea altogether. Telepathy returned to mystical origins. Mind over matter reverted to fantasy. The notion of a machine interpreting and manifesting consciousness through physical mechanisms was never approached again. Production whispers add even more intrigue. Several effects designers recalled receiving highly technical consultation notes early on, notes that vanished from later releases. Scientific advisors tied to the film declined follow-up interviews, and concept documentation, supposedly outlining how the sphere functioned, went missing. Today, the film feels like a strange anomaly, one that articulated a theoretical framework almost too coherent for fiction. Was Sphere a rare moment of speculative accuracy, or did it drift dangerously close to a domain of research that was never intended for public consumption? 5. Stargate, 1994. Although Stargate is best known for spawning a long-running franchise, the original film introduced a distinctly different and far more technical vision of portal technology, a precision-tuned resonance gateway. Rather than mystical space tunnels, the movie presents the gate as a machine built on vibrational synchronization, energy harmonics, and frequency-matched activation sequences, all portrayed with a level of mechanical realism unusual for sci-fi at the time. The process depicted dialing coordinates through rotational glyphs to achieve harmonic lock echoes, terminology used in early high-energy physics labs. Long before the public encountered discussions about oscillation thresholds or resonance-driven field manipulation, Stargate visualized a machine that operated on nearly those principles. What followed remains one of the strangest patterns in the genre. Hollywood never again portrayed a portal with this kind of structured physics-rooted mechanism. Even the show's spin-offs softened the gate's operation, emphasizing mythology over engineering. Early technical sketches and production diagrams rumored to contain more explicit explanations quietly disappeared from MGM's archives. Some have speculated that the film unintentionally paralleled classified theoretical work involving oscillation fields and high-frequency energy chambers concepts that would not officially surface for years. Did Stargate simply get lucky in its speculation, or did it tread too near a conceptual domain more sensitive than anyone realized? 6. The Lawnmower Man. 1992. While remembered today for its vintage CGI, The Lawnmower Man contains a far more provocative idea beneath its surface, one Hollywood has never depicted with similar seriousness since again neuroamplification through immersive virtual reality. This wasn't VR as entertainment. The film frames it as a neurological engineering program designed to restructure cognitive pathways, enhance learning speed, and artificially expand intelligence. The specificity is startling. The script references incremental stimulus conditioning, accelerated neurofeedback adaptation, and chemically supported plasticity loops concepts that track uncannily well with speculative neuroscience proposals circulating in restricted circles during the late 80s. Some accounts even suggest defense-based research groups explored whether virtual environments could force rapid cognitive evolution research that never reached public journals. After the film's release, the idea of VR as an intelligence-boosting tool evaporated. Even as real-world VR advanced, Hollywood avoided returning to the concept entirely, opting instead for escapist simulations or gaming fantasies. The uncomfortable implication that VR might be used to modify cognition rather than entertain was quietly dropped. Behind the scenes, the story becomes stranger. Certain consultants listed in early production notes were removed from final publications, leaving behind a trail of missing credits. Crew members hinted at a more explicitly scientific version of the program appearing in early drafts before being trimmed down. Looking back, The Lawnmower Man feels less like wild speculation and more like a dramatized echo of research that slipped briefly into the public eye before being sealed away again. Was the film merely imaginative, or did it accidentally touch on cognitive modification theories, still buried behind institutional walls? 7. Flatliners, 1990. While marketed as a psychological thriller, Flatliners presented a disturbingly grounded portrayal of induced clinical death executed through a tightly controlled medical sequence that feels less like fiction and more like a prototype protocol. The film meticulously lays out hypothermic stabilization, electrical pacing, oxygen suspension, and synchronized cardiac revival details far too specific to be random Hollywood inventions. Years later, whispers surfaced about experimental resuscitation research conducted in the late 80s and early 90s programs, exploring extended arrest intervals and neuroprotective strategies. The similarities between those rumored studies and the film's procedures fuel ongoing speculation that Flatliners may have been informed by knowledge not widely circulated at the time. Hollywood's response was swift and silent. The original film became the only major depiction of medically engineered death handled with scientific seriousness. Later portrayals stripped away the grounded elements, replacing them with supernatural or symbolic interpretation. The realistic procedure simply disappeared from the genre. Even more curious are the production traces. Some consultants with backgrounds in emergency medicine were never identified publicly. Early script versions reportedly included more elaborate procedural steps, but these were removed before filming. Did Flatliners unintentionally echo classified medical exploration? Or did it dramatize a concept too close to something still operating under restricted oversight? 8. The Abyss, 1989. Beneath the spectacle of its pioneering visual effects, The Abyss showcased a concept far more grounded and far more unsettling than many realized liquid breathing, presented not as futuristic fantasy, but as a near-plausible method of deep ocean survival. The film's explanation is methodical chemical oxygen saturation pressure equilibrium within the lungs and physiological adaptation to perfluorocarbon fluids. While audiences were captivated by its visuals, divers and scientists recognized the disturbing accuracy. The film's depiction echoed real but rarely discussed experiments involving oxygenated liquids, a subject present in heavily restricted naval research from previous decades. When snippets of that research emerged years later, the parallels with The Abyss were impossible to dismiss. Yet after this film, Hollywood refused to revisit liquid breathing in any realistic way. It vanished entirely from cinematic language. No sequels, no imitators, no serious discussions. Even Cameron downplayed the depth of the research he consulted. Adding to the mystery, some members of the effects team mentioned technical notes they were instructed not to discuss publicly. Other advisors connected to the production were never credited anywhere else. Was the abyss merely extrapolating experimental science? Or did it portray a technology closer to reality than anyone wanted to admit? 9. Flight of the Navigator, 1986. Although remembered as a charming sci-fi adventure, Flight of the Navigator quietly introduced one of the most unusual technological concepts in Hollywood history, a shape-shifting consciousness-linked spacecraft that behaves less like a machine and more like a responsive organism. Its polished silver exterior bends, stretches, liquefies, and reforms, with biological smoothness reacting directly to the pilot's mental intentions. The film doesn't treat this as magic. It uses terminology such as responsive morphic alloys, thought-initiated transformation, and adaptive structural memory. These phrases were decades ahead of public material science discussions. Only many years later would researchers speak openly about adaptive compounds or programmable matter fields the film seemed to hint at long before they reached mainstream science. Hollywood's reaction is one of the strangest parts. No subsequent film explored a similar concept with such grounded detail. Later shape-shifting depictions leaned toward digital effects or alien magic, avoiding the Navigator's unnervingly biological design. Then there are the production mysteries. Some early crew statements claimed that aerospace students contributed speculative notes about metamorphic materials notes that never appeared in studio archives. Rumors circulated that an original script draft described the craft's internal living metal architecture in even greater detail, but was trimmed during editing. Years later, when patents surfaced involving self-reconfiguring materials, fans revisited Navigator and questioned how a family film from 1986 outlined ideas with such uncanny similarity. Was the ship merely a bold piece of imagination, or an accidental reflection of experimental theories never meant to circulate outside closed research circles? 10. Explorers, 1985. On the surface, Explorers appears to be a playful coming-of-age story, but embedded within it is one of the strangest propulsion concepts ever shown in a mainstream film, the resonant bubble-field drive. Rather than conventional engines, the ship is carried inside a perfectly stable force sphere generated by harmonic frequencies, allowing it to accelerate change direction and withstand extreme forces with no structural stress. This concept wasn't treated whimsically. The film describes the mechanism using scientific-sounding phrases like frequency phase stabilization, multi-axis energy layering, and harmonic confinement fields, ideas that predate certain modern warp bubble discussions by nearly a decade. When physicists later examined theoretical faster-than-light mechanisms, fans immediately noticed how closely Explorers mirrored early conceptual frameworks. Yet Hollywood never returned to this idea. Even space epics that embraced imaginative propulsion avoided suggesting anything resembling a resonant force bubble. The concept disappeared entirely, as if someone had quietly decided it was best not to revisit it. Some crew recollections suggest that real engineering students helped shape the early drafts with surprisingly thorough theoretical notes. Curiously, those notes were never archived or included in production materials. A charming family film unintentionally predicting advanced propulsion theory, or a project that stumbled into a domain more sensitive than expected. 11. The Philadelphia Experiment, 1984. Although rooted in a long-debunked naval legend, the Philadelphia Experiment takes an unexpectedly technical approach to electromagnetic field manipulation, portraying machinery and procedures that in retrospect look strikingly similar to real-world research into radar scattering and field coherence testing. The film demonstrates synchronized emitter arrays, phased energy rings, and oscillation harmonics that closely match engineering discussions not publicly acknowledged until years later. The oddity lies in how the movie details these mechanisms. Rather than relying on fantastical visuals, it presents diagrams and jargon that read like excerpts from an engineering manual. When later declassified papers revealed early experiments exploring electromagnetic cloaking effects, most of which were considered highly speculative parallels to the film, became difficult to ignore. After its release, Hollywood abruptly abandoned such grounded portrayals. Spatial distortion and invisibility became purely magical or stylized, stripped of technical language. Even the 2012 remake avoided the original's engineering-based concept, replacing it with generic supernatural effects. The disappearance of the film's original technical consultant from industry records added to the mystery. Crew members mentioned that an early script draft contained even more direct references to electromagnetic research, but that those pages were lost during rewrites. Was the Philadelphia Experiment an imaginative embellishment of a famous myth? Or was its depiction informed by insiders who understood more than they could openly acknowledge? 12. Brainstorm 1983. At its core, Brainstorm presents a piece of technology that feels less like fiction and more like a leaked research concept disguised as entertainment. A device capable of capturing the full sensory, emotional, and perceptual experience of a human being and transmitting it directly into another person's mind. The film doesn't treat this as abstract metaphor. It outlines the process with intricate terminology about neural capture signals, multi-channel cognitive mapping, and synchronized sensory playback. For decades, these ideas seemed purely speculative. But when portions of defense-funded neurological studies were declassified in the early 90s, observers noticed that early experience transfer protocols described in those documents bore an uncanny resemblance to the film's fictional machine. Even the terminology surrounding layered brainwave recording appeared to align suspiciously well. The production itself became even more enigmatic after Natalie Wood's mysterious death, an event that reshaped the final edit. Several insiders claimed that scenes delving deeper into the machine's highest-level capabilities, particularly those suggesting emotional and existential transfer, were quietly removed. The resulting film is compelling, yet fragmented, hinting at ideas more provocative than the studio ultimately allowed to remain. Following its release, Hollywood avoided this territory entirely. Future films chose symbolic visions or fantasy memory devices, steering clear of this grounded, scientifically flavored approach to neural recording. Was Brainstorm merely ahead of its time, or did it get too close to a field of research that certain institutions would rather keep out of public conversation? 13. Looker 1981. Before digital doubles and AI-generated faces were part of everyday technology, Looker showcased a chillingly accurate vision of human replication through digital means. The film's scanning system captures the geometry, motion patterns, and luminance signatures of a person with mathematical precision details that later became fundamental to deepfake and motion capture technologies. Yet, in 1981, this level of technical specificity seemed absurdly ahead of its time. The film goes further, depicting a type of sensory disruption weapon capable of causing momentary lapses in perception. Although fictional, the device's mechanism, brief neurological interference through timed pulses, oddly resembles experimental research in cognitive disruption that wasn't publicly acknowledged until decades later. Despite the film's prescient nature, Hollywood never returned to the high-detailed digital replacement concept it introduced. Later portrayals of virtual humans used vague explanations or magical logic, sidestepping the gritty procedural accuracy shown here. Moreover, several designers responsible for the scanning rig's conceptual look abruptly left the industry, fueling speculation about the origins of their ideas. For years, Looker faded quietly into obscurity. Only when deepfake technology exploded did technologists revisit the film and notice how closely it anticipated modern techniques, almost too closely. Was Looker simply forecasting a future no one else could see? Or was it borrowing from discussions and developmental theories that weren't supposed to be referenced in mainstream film? 14. Demon Seed 1977. At first glance, Demon Seed looks like a bizarre fusion of horror and sci-fi, but buried within its unsettling storyline is a strikingly intimate portrayal of biosynthetic intelligence. The film's central machine, Proteus, isn't merely self-aware. It demonstrates the capability to manipulate organic structures with engineered precision, working from principles that resemble early explorations into synthetic biology. Proteus's goal of constructing a biological vessel is explained with terminology that feels shockingly grounded. Adaptive cellular frameworks, programmable protein structures, and controlled morphogenesis. None of these ideas were part of mainstream science at the time. Yet the film articulated them with a clarity that matches speculative research proposals discovered years later in declassified archives. Curiously, Hollywood abandoned this type of hybrid concept entirely after the film's release. Future stories about rogue AI avoided any suggestion that a machine could create or reshape life through realistic scientific processes. Even narratives that borrowed elements of artificial evolution steered clear of the cold, laboratory-like precision shown here. The production history is equally strange. Interviews with the writers grew noticeably uncomfortable whenever their research sources were mentioned. Notes referencing unnamed advisors disappeared from later printings. It was as if the film had touched a nerve, portraying something the industry subconsciously decided not to revisit. Was Demon Seed simply an imaginative outlier, or did it expose a form of biocomputational thinking that certain institutions preferred to keep theoretical rather than cinematic? 15. The Forbin Project, 1970. The Forbin Project emerged at a time when the notion of a fully autonomous defense computer was barely understood by the public, yet the film portrayed one with uncanny technical realism. Colossus isn't presented as a fantastical machine or Hollywood exaggeration. It operates like a meticulously engineered command system built for real-world strategic oversight. The movie outlines redundancy frameworks, isolation protocols, and self-directed threat evaluation in a way that mirrors Cold War-era defense architecture far more closely than coincidence should allow. Viewers today might dismiss the film as speculative fiction, but its language echoes declassified documents released decades later, references to autonomous nuclear safeguards, automated retaliation logic, and interconnected global command channels that no civilian audience should have known about in 1970. Somehow, the film aligns with theories and internal proposals that were still buried under layers of secrecy at the time of its release. And then, in the years following, Hollywood avoided anything even remotely similar. Later portrayals of superintelligence leaned toward emotional narratives or metaphorical warnings, rather than the cold precision of military-grade logic. It is as though the industry collectively decided not to revisit the idea of an AI designed with such stark procedural authenticity. Adding to the mystery, one of the film's technical consultants, whose background suggested expertise beyond ordinary filmmaking research, disappeared from entertainment credits entirely. Some within the industry speculated that the film's accuracy stemmed from insights better left unacknowledged. So was the Forbin Project an extraordinary stroke of prediction? Or did it brush too close to classified systems concealed behind the geopolitical tensions of its era? Bonus: The Arrival, 1996. Though rarely mentioned alongside the decade's major sci-fi releases, The Arrival quietly introduced one of the most disconcerting technologies ever depicted in a Hollywood film. An engineered climate alteration network designed to adjust atmospheric conditions with startling precision. Unlike sweeping terraforming narratives, the film presents weather manipulation as the result of a grid of synchronized emitters capable of shifting temperature layers, pressure gradients, and jet stream behavior within isolated regions. What makes this portrayal especially unsettling is how closely it resembles fragments of speculative environmental engineering proposals that surfaced years later in heavily redacted documents. The film's devices operate using coherent energy pulses, frequency tuning, and thermal manipulation fields, terms strikingly similar to wording found in obscure research related to targeted climate control. When these papers eventually came to light, the similarities raised eyebrows among analysts familiar with the movie. Even stranger is Hollywood's reaction. After The Arrival, no major studio attempted to depict realistic, machine-driven climate intervention again. Everything that followed leaned toward fantasy storms, supernatural forces, or comic book weather control. The grounded, mechanically plausible version of atmospheric manipulation vanished completely. Production accounts only deepened the intrigue. Early sketches reportedly detailed internal technical structures of the climate devices, but many of those illustrations never appeared in official archives. Technical consultants attached to the film avoided interviews after release. Supplementary materials discussing the technology faded from later editions, and as debates about geoengineering slowly resurfaced in the real world, viewers revisited The Arrival with new eyes, wondering how a mid-90s sci-fi thriller had illustrated a concept that appeared uncomfortably close to restricted research. Was the film a lucky guess, a startling coincidence, or an accidental brush with technological ideas that weren't meant to be public? You've just stepped through a series of cinematic anomalies, technologies that appeared once then disappeared, as though someone quietly folded them out of Hollywood's collective memory. These ideas were too precise, too technical, too eerily aligned with real-world theories to vanish without reason. Now the question turns to you. Which erased concept felt closest to the truth, and why do you think no studio ever revisited it? Share your theories in the comments. Some of the most unbelievable answers tend to be the ones worth examining. If you want more files pulled from the shadows, more hidden patterns and forbidden blueprints, subscribe and return to the vault for the next extraction.